cell signaling, which once again, one of the most important things we mentioned, we led on to it on Tuesday, last Tuesday. We went on a little bit to cell signaling. One of the things about cell signaling, of course, cells have to coordinate their activities and communicate with each other in a multicellular organism. You've got things like restricting cell growth. Failure to do that, of course, is essentially what cancer is. You want to make sure that certain tissues or organs grow to a certain size and shape and don't overgrow or don't undergrow. Cells communicate with each other and cause them to differentiate in specific ways. Many times during organ formation, you get a crosstalk between two different types of cells, two or more different types of cells, and they're constantly communicating with each other, stimulating them to differentiate in particular ways, and then ultimately end up producing entire organs, things like that. So cell signaling and cell communication is very, very important in development. It's also important in things like tissue maintenance, wound healing, repair, tissue repair, things like that. Although it's one of its most important things, of course, is in early development, when you're forming all these different organs and tissues. So you've got different kinds of signals. You're going to have things that are, I could call global signals. These are things released maybe by a limited number of cell types, but they circulate around the entire organism and have a wide range of different effects on different target cells. Good example of those are the steroid hormones, but that's not the only kinds of things, and we'll look at those separately. That's not the only kinds of things that have such a broad-ranging effect. So you've got that type of stuff. Secreted molecules, whether they're small molecules or large molecules, that affect things over the entire organism, no matter where the original source of them happen to be. So you have that. You have things that are much more local. Okay, local effects are going to be, you have some kind of cell secreting some kind of signaling agent. That stuff will diffuse from the source of the cell, but it can't go too far. Once it gets too far, it gets too diluted to have much of an effect. So you may have, for instance, a cell that signals, or a tissue that signals cells close by, but can't do much far away. Good example of that. The notochord. We mentioned the notochord secretes, is not just a stiffening rod. Of course, that notochord is by definition, that's what makes a chordate. You have this notochord, which is sort of almost a cartilage-like material. Mesodermal cells that run the whole, the dorsal part of the embryo from head to tail. Okay, now, in most organisms that disappears, we don't have a notochord anymore, but early on in our development we did. We've seen notochords a lot of times in all these cross-sections of slides. It's not just the stiffening rod that later on gets replaced by the backbone. It does not turn into the backbone, it gets replaced by the backbone. You had a question? Oh, that you did. It looked like you had a question. All right, well anyway, the notochord also plays an important role secreting molecules that organize the neural tube, which is right above it. We recall a lot of our embryos, you would see the neural tube, the future central nervous system, and beneath that is the notochord. It secretes molecules that are going to cause both the dorsal ventral part of the neural tube to differentiate in different ways, and down the length of the notochord, you secrete various kinds of molecules that are going to do the anterior-posterior, head-to-tail differentiation of the neural tube. In other words, one part becomes the brain, the other part becomes various parts of the spinal cord. Now the thing is, these molecules don't travel all that far. They'll have a dramatic effect here, they'll have a lesser effect over here, and way out over here, they're not going to have any effect. So this is an example of a sort of local type of cell signaling. So that's the second thing we can have. We can have things that have a fairly local, limited effect, but they don't go throughout the whole organism. Now the third thing. The third thing is where cells have to actually be physically right next to each other. Either have direct cell-to-cell contact, meaning one cell type has receptors that bind to receptors on another cell type. So they're right next to each other. Or the what we call ECM, or extracellular matrix, the secreted proteins and polysaccharides that surround each cell. That also can play a signaling role. But here again, the target cell has to be embedded in that material, which is basically right by the producing cell. So here you have to have pretty close to direct contact. And all three of these types play critical roles in development. Just what does what where? We will see. Okay, so that's just a little bit of an overview of the types of interactions we can get, the types of signaling interactions we can get. But for the most part, what we're going to do is all of these interactions depend on signaling pathways. And that's what we're going to introduce ourselves in. Once again, this is going to be, hopefully, sound very familiar, at least to those of you who took cell with me, and most of you folks did. I don't know, does Dr. Hamasu go through a lot of cell signaling in his class? Okay, his orientation is different than mine. I know his teaching style, those of you who had cell with me, like just being in the hospital a couple of times, that was kind of a shock to the system, I guess. Okay, but at any rate, all right, so, okay, if you took it with Hamasu, it's probably not going to be all that familiar. If you took it with me, a lot of it should come back, and many of you folks did. Okay, well, so we look at cell signaling. Okay, once again, cells have to know what's going on in the world around them. They have to know about environmental conditions. They have to know who their neighbors are. They have to know what's been squirted into the bloodstream or body fluids. And they have to respond to those things. In effect, cell signaling is very much, good analogy would be very much like our sense organs and our sensory systems. Ah, you got me something nice? Good. Okay, pull it out. All right. Okay. Did I give you your exam back?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Just want to double check. Okay. Let me grab this. Thank you. Okay. More stuff to do after that. Sorry about that. Okay, well, in a sense, it's very much like the sense organs and stuff in a cell, or rather in a person. If you lost all of your sense organs for one reason or another, brain damage or whatever the case is, you would be in bad shape. You wouldn't be able to detect anything that's going around. Once in a great while, that actually happens to somebody, usually serious injury to the brain or something like that. And, they sometimes call it locked-in syndrome. They're alive and fully conscious, but they have no way of knowing what's going around them and no way of communicating out. Sounds like hell. I'm probably very close to the biblical concept of hell. But anyway, they're lost without that, and nothing. Cells have to do that. Cells have the same kind of thing. They got to know what's going on around them. And for us, we have a whole wide range of sense organs. We've got things in our skin that detect temperature, pressure, abrasion, stuff like that, stretching or overstretching, what have you. We have our eyes, we have our chemical senses like smell and taste. We can hear, we can pick up sound waves in the air. Whole bunch of different kinds of sense organs. So cells have to have some type of sense organ too. And those are what we would call receptor proteins. These act like the sense organs. These are proteins that are spanning through the cell membrane entirely. So part of them is outside the cell and part of them is inside the cytoplasm. And these are going to act, at least not all receptors, but many receptors act as sense organs. they'll detect various things in the environment. Okay, now, that would be all well and good. That would be well and good. But the cell has to be able to respond to what it detects on the outside world. If you couldn't respond to that, you know it's there, but you can't do anything about it, that doesn't help a lot. Now, case in point, let's suppose I took this eraser. He didn't flinch much. What if I really did throw it? You get that about me, beat the crap out of me. Okay, sorry. Okay, but, all right. Oh, you're a bad test subject. Okay, now, you know, I suddenly looked like I'm going to toss the eraser. She did flinch, not much, but she did flinch. She saw this movement, and she made, and I was trying to make as much a surprise as I could to get some kind of reaction, and she made some kind of response. Now, let's suppose I really did throw the eraser at her. She would do something. Her sense organs would see this eraser coming towards her, and she would either duck, knock it out of the way, or what have you, and then she'd go up screaming to the dean about me. And it'd be posted up on YouTube too, right? Okay, but she would respond to that. She would respond to that. Okay, so in that case, what's happening? Your sense organs, your receptors, your eyes are picking up this change in light pattern, meaning showing that an eraser is coming towards you at fairly high speed. That signal goes up to processing center, up the optic nerves into your brain processing center, and then it sends signals to various muscles to generate a response. Cells have to do something like that too. Having the sense organs by itself, in other words, having the receptors, is enough. So now we have to have some kind of signaling pathway. Now this whole process is often called signal transduction. You'll see this a lot of times in the literature. How do we get from signal to final response? Now in the case with tossing an eraser, the signal has to come from the retina, go up the optic nerve, get sent around various parts, go up to the various, make connections with other neurons that are going to control the motor nerves, send the signals back, and now you get your final response. And then the rest of it, and the other thing going up and screaming to me about it. But, okay, so that stuff is effectively the signal transduction for her. Cells are going to have that too, and that's what we're going to look at, a number of signaling pathways. Now, there are signaling pathways up the wazoo. There are signaling pathways, many different kinds of signaling pathways. Matter of fact, you look at my office, there's this poster I got from an ad from a journal that has a whole bunch, maps out a whole bunch, and even out a fully inclusive list of different signaling pathways. We're going to look at several representative ones, including some that are very important in development, and deliberately ignore some of the others. For instance, there are these protein signaling molecules called cytokines that play major roles in development of the red blood cells, the white blood cells, various types of white blood cells, and what have you. Most of them have their own signaling pathway that we're going to ignore. You can go take Dr. Blair's immunology course if you want to pick some of that stuff up. But, and they use quite a few of these drugs commercially and sometimes abuse them, things like the EPO, the drug that stimulates red blood cell production. It's used clinically to treat various kinds of anemias, and it's used by Lance Armstrong and stuff like that to cheat. There have been a number of people who had their medals stripped away because if you have unusually high levels, they can get really suspicious. Okay, so yeah, that, but a lot of these things are used clinically, but we're going to ignore that particular pathway. That's fairly specific for the cells of the blood-forming cells and cells of the immune system. But we're going to look at several others. Okay, so that's sort of the quick and dirty of a signaling pathway. But what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at signaling pathways and look at several critical elements of them.